Hello and welcome to The Daily. I'm Niall Paterson, and today we are once again talking about immigration, specifically the total number coming here to the UK.
Under the previous government, immigration was far too high and the system was badly out of control. Net migration needs to come down radically from hundreds of thousands a year to just tens of thousands.
Now that was David Cameron, of course, speaking back in the first year of his Conservative government. That was all the way back in 2010. Not that things had improved one iota when Theresa May said this in the election campaign of 2017.
So I think it is important that we continue, and we will continue to say that we do want to bring net migration down to sustainable levels. We believe that is the tens of thousands.
And not one of you will be surprised to hear what Boris Johnson was saying in the election 2 years later.
I've said that what we want to do is bear down on migration, particularly of unskilled workers who have no job to come to.
Successive Conservative governments, including this one, have promised to sort it all out. All the while, the figures have shown they've done nothing of the sort, and the data for 2022 is now out.
They've literally just dropped. I'm being told that they are 606,000. Net migration is 606,000 people.
On this episode, we will be pulling apart the data underpinning that eye-watering, record-breaking figure. We'll be asking why the Conservatives continue to beat this drum, given how their record on migration might play out at the next election. And we'll be seeing what, if anything, can be done, and whether it needs to be done. Well, the data came from the Office for National Statistics and comes with a whole host of analysis, graphs and figures. So I've handed those straight over to our data and forensics correspondent, Tom Cheshire. Tom, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Let's start with the headline figure. I mean, it's eye-watering, but not perhaps as eye-watering as some people had led us to believe.
You know, it's not 1 million, which is what had been promised by some. It is still huge. This is still a record for a calendar year, more than 600,000 people. So I don't think we should lose sight of that just because it's lower than expected.
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps the best bit of expectation management by the government since, well, the local election results. Let's focus, though, on where this 600,000 figure comes from. Can we split it into EU, non-EU?
Yeah, and actually, that's one of the things you do see in the data is 2019, at the end of that year, that's the moment when non-EU migration overtakes EU. And that's obviously timing with the Brexit and the new rules coming in. Actually now, non-EU migration is actually negative. So more people are leaving than are coming, and all that growth is coming from non-EU migration. And all those visas are controlled by the government compared to before with the EU when there was less control over borders. These are all visas issued by the government, people that the government has allowed to come here.
So how fair is it to say then that whilst the government has taken back control, they have used that control to let in record numbers of people from non-European Union countries?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it.
OK, we've got the headline figure. But do we know where these people are coming from? So, I mean, specifically, of course, talking here about non-EU.
Yeah, in terms of non-EU, there's India is a really big one. Nigeria, they've been really big drivers of the growth in all sorts of visas, study and work visas too. But yeah, so that's where you're seeing that non-EU migration coming from mainly India and Nigeria, that growth.
OK, so India, Nigeria, understand that. But we are also seeing from Ukraine, presumably, because of the war, but also from Hong Kong because of that Chinese takeover.
Yeah, I mean, so last year that was around 172,000 people.
Wow.
Which was a jump on the year before. But at the start of that scheme for Ukraine, you had around 10,000 people per week applying for that. That's now down to around 1,000 per week. So that has already come down.
Headline figure 600k plus. But in that figure, we now have asylum seekers included as well. And running at roughly, 76,000, I think it was?
So that's part of the new revision to this and why some of the figures aren't directly comparable to what they were before. But yeah, it is a very small number in comparison. And you see that especially when we're talking about non-legal migrations defined by the government in terms of the small boats. They are very, very small in comparison to these legal routes, which the government certainly does have control of.
Just because there has been an awful lot of chat about overseas students, their dependents being a real burden on the system and a big driver of these figures, what is that number in terms of them? Can we put a specific number on that?
I mean, family accounted for 6% of non-EU long-term immigration, with an estimated 51,000 compared to 62,000 in 2021. So that is already slightly smaller than than it was. It's obviously something the government feels it can control because it still wants those students. Obviously, it's not restricting those. It's still got the graduate route for students, which I think has been an incentive. That means students can stay for 2 years afterwards if they're working or looking for work in the UK. But again, if we really zoom out, long-term picture, if you look at sort of 10 years down the line, I think it's less than 10% of people who come on a student visa will end up staying. So 10 years later, the vast majority of them have left. And then if we really zoom out, we're going
I'm squinting here.
Global view, yeah. The UK population has changed. So maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was around 9% of the UK population was foreign born. Today, that's around 14%. There has been an increase. But then if you look at it compared to other countries, especially other OECD countries, so countries that, similar levels of economic development, the UK has stayed in the same place. It's very squarely in the middle of the pack. It's slightly more than France, slightly less than Germany. It's nowhere near somewhere like Australia, which has a huge amount of immigration. So obviously, there's a huge amount of debate about this. It's worth sort of remembering we're very much in the middle of the pack here.
So the idea that 600,000 plus is the new normal, and that is what we should expect from now until time immemorial, that doesn't wash.
Yeah, I mean, forecast for this has always been really hard, but it does feel that it's not going to be permanently this high, but it's not going to be in the tens of thousands, as was promised many moons ago. This is going to be significant for a long time going forward.
Can we cope, though? I mean, when we were talking about net migration in kind of the low hundreds of thousands, 200, 250,000, the argument that there was no room at the inn perhaps didn't wash as much as the argument today when we're talking well in excess of 600,000 people coming here.
Yeah, I mean, put it in perspective. In 1 year, you've had a population roughly the size of Glasgow added to the UK. Glasgow's
which country wants Glasgow added to their country
Glasgow.
Every year? Yes.
But then
watch yourself.
You're not just talking about Glasgow, a beautiful city full of lovely people as well.
Well done.
But to support those lovely people, you have a huge amount of infrastructure. You've got 9 big hospital sites. You've got more than 100 primary schools. You've got, crucially, nearly 300,000 houses. Some of it may not be too important. So when we're talking about migrants, they tend to be working age. So they don't put as much pressure on the NHS as the British population does, which is older. They don't tend to be children either compared to the British-born population. So that means less pressure on schools, especially housing, though. 300,000, that's what's required to house Glasgow, right? So housing, I think, is one of those things you really do have to look at and say, well, look, if we do want to accommodate this huge record number of people, you need to be investing in the infrastructure to make that a smooth accommodation.
Tom, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Probably a good time then to turn our attentions to the politics of all of this. Our political correspondent, Ali Fortescue, is in Westminster. Look, what have we been hearing from the government? Because figures this high, at the very least, we know they're not where they want them to be.
Yeah, they're definitely not. They were definitely trying to distance themselves from these migration numbers. That was part of the reason there was no minister on the morning round today. And it was all pretty quiet from the Home Secretary and the Immigration Minister. We've just seen the first kind of response, really, from the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, in the House of Commons, responding to an urgent question from Labour. And he said it was due to temporary and exceptional factors,
such as the UK's Ukraine and Hong Kong BNO schemes.
And this is key. He said the government is committed to reducing migration whilst continuing to benefit from skills and resources our economy needs. And there is a debate going on in Cabinet right now at the heart of government, because there are those like Suella Braverman on one side that are talking really tough on legal migration, and those like the Chancellor that want to open up migration to key sectors to help with the workforce shortage. And that is a debate that's being had in Cabinet.
Look, you and I have both said that the figures are not where the government would want them to be. So what is the government's policy on migration? There is this plan to restrict students coming here to study, bringing their dependents with them. That might have some effect, but it certainly won't come close to reducing this figure by hundreds of thousands. So is it the case that this government is, on the one hand, talking tough about immigration, but then also taking advantage of the benefits that you get from these incredibly significant numbers?
Yeah, exactly. And, the rhetoric is one thing. The government talking certainly very tough on illegal migration and talking about cutting net migration. But the Conservatives have been on a journey from talking about tens of thousands under David Cameron and Theresa May, Boris Johnson talking about getting the numbers to less than 250,000. Rishi Sunak last week was effectively moving away from that number. So they're not setting any targets, really. They're just saying they want to bring the numbers down. It was interesting. I spoke to James Johnson, who's a former number 10 pollster, and he was saying he thinks the government are slowly moving from a position of talking about the importance of reducing immigration to controlling migration. But for him, he says there's a tension between where the government are and the public are, because for the public, and I certainly saw this, I was in South Thanet yesterday, they view illegal and legal migration together, really, and they want to see numbers coming down in some of those target Conservative seats.
But look, we're not a country mile from a general election, are we? At which immigration, legal or illegal, will certainly be a big old topic. And you're going to have people like Rishi Sunak and indeed Suella Rwanda Braverman standing in front of the British public talking incredibly tough. But then the Labour Party will be able, as you've alluded to point to every general election since the Conservatives got in 2010, when they have said exactly the same thing. We're going to get it sorted. We're going to get the numbers down. And they've done nothing of the sort.
Yeah, and, traditionally, Conservatives have tended to poll better with voters on immigration. And I think the Conservatives have thought that talking about it sends a message, and the fact that, stopping the boats is one of Rishi Sunak's top 5 priorities and not one of Keir Starmer's is something that a few people have kind of brought up when I've been speaking to members of the public. But the numbers, firstly, speak for themselves. And when it comes to small boats, the images of people appearing on the Kent coast is obviously cutting through with some voters. On Labour, they're not a million miles from where the Conservatives are. They're talking about cutting migration, but again, they're not giving a specific people. They're talking about training up British people to do jobs to tackle the problems with workforce shortage. That is obviously, Suella Braverman's language is pretty inflammatory at times, but that is similar to what she's been talking about.
Is it perhaps possible, Ali, that whilst obviously Conservative leaders have to speak to their base, they also have to speak to the population at large? And you look at this country and you compare it to some of our closest allies just across the channel, where there are far right-wing populist parties running on anti-immigration platforms. We don't really have that in this country. Is it perhaps possible that the general public are a bit more sanguine about migration to this country than the Conservatives would have you believe?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. And, the Conservatives don't really face much of a threat on the right anymore.
Yeah, Nigel Farage, UKIP, they are not the presence in UK politics that they once were, are they?
Yeah, exactly. I think they think that that's a space they can fill. And, we've seen them going big on the kind of cultural wars issues ahead of the next election. I think the worry is that does that alienate some voters in those Lib Dem facing seats? And I've certainly spoken to people in places like Isha, Dominic Raab's constituency, who have not been particularly happy with some of the language from the Home Secretary and some of the approaches to illegal migration, things like the Rwanda policy. So is, Labour being accused of straddling the line? Is that actually a better approach that doesn't alienate people on both sides? I think, immigration has always been a decisive and divisive topic for decades, but finding the right answer isn't necessarily straightforward.
Now, as Ali was saying a moment ago, there don't appear to be any easy answers to sky-high net migration. Otherwise, this government would have taken them, surely. Nor is it immediately clear that immigration on this level is necessarily a bad thing. So in an attempt to take some of the heat out of the debate, let's adopt a rather more empirical approach with Madeleine Sumption, Director of the Migration Observatory at Oxford University, and also someone who advises governments on immigration policy. Madeleine, why is the net migration figure for 2022 so high?
There are basically 3 things going on at once, and the fact they've all come together at the same time is, I think, the reason that we see this peak now. On the one hand, you have the war in Ukraine, and there were a substantial number of people who fled Ukraine and came to the UK. We then have a boom in recruitment of international students. Now, most of those people are expected only to be in the UK temporarily, but in the short run, they still contribute to net migration as they come in. Then the third factor is people coming on work visas. These numbers have gone up, and by far the biggest factor in the increase is the health and care sector, where we've seen actually quite surprising increases in the recruitment. And this will be both doctors and nurses in the NHS, but also care workers coming in after the immigration system was liberalised early last year to make it possible for employers to sponsor care workers from non-EU countries.
Just remind us about that, because this is under the skilled worker visa scheme that we've been talking about, actually, indeed, on the podcast this week, and some of the problems with it. But when it comes to the care sector, not much in the way of qualifications required, certainly not much in the way of salary, but there is a massive gaping hole in the care sector that these people are coming to fill.
That's right, and there's evidence that there have been really serious shortages in the care sector. That was not just because of the end of free movement. There are much longer term factors, including a funding model that effectively sort of bakes in the minimum wage for many care workers. So, in part, in response to these shortages, the government liberalised the immigration system early last year. And what's really interesting is that the response has been very significant. In 2022 alone, the Home Office is estimating around 57,000 people were given care visas. And so it looks like actually the numbers of people coming in under the new regime greatly exceed the number of EU citizens who were coming to do care work before Brexit.
Am I right then to assume from what you're saying, Madeleine, that if pay is low in this sector and the conditions are difficult, then one way that we could bring down net migration to this country is by increasing the amount that we pay people working in the care sector?
Yes, broadly speaking, I think that's true. There is some uncertainty about exactly how much you would have to pay in order to attract a lot of British people into the job. It's clear, I think, that most people want more than the minimum wage to do care work because it can be difficult, it's stressful. And this comes to one of the core trade-offs that we actually see in a lot of areas of immigration, which is that it comes down to policy choices. You could invest a lot more money to improve paying conditions and attract more workers into the sector. Obviously, that comes at a cost, and the funding of social care has been really controversial for years now. But in the long run, I think it's difficult to see a long-term solution that doesn't involve some increases in pay.
As you're well aware, since the Conservatives got in 2010, we have heard a litany of different ideas from different prime ministers about where the net migration figure should be and targets, bring it down underneath and all the rest of it. I mean, is it possible to quantify an ideal number, a net migration target that would fill all the needs that we have in this country and not overly burden housing, burden the NHS and so on? Is it possible to pick a number as a target and stick to it?
Basically, I think no, for two reasons. One is that it's actually difficult for governments to guarantee a specific number of people because policy typically doesn't dictate exactly the number of visas that will be issued. Policy dictates who's eligible, right? So doctors and nurses are eligible, or care workers are eligible, or international students. But the number of people who take up that offer will often change, sometimes quite substantially, even if policy is the same. The broader issue is, how would you pick that number if you did want to guarantee target? And I think economists tend not to have a view, actually, on what the right level of migration is, because ultimately the economy adjusts to the number of people who are in it. And it often just comes down to these policy choices.
I suppose that there are two questions that need to be answered. First, can net migration be significantly brought down through public policy? And secondly, is that desirable? Do we want to see the numbers come down, or is it still the case that immigrants to this country are net contributors to the economy?
I think, so in answer to the first question, can the numbers be brought down through public policy? Yes, I think they can. As I mentioned, there's a reasonable expectation, nothing is ever guaranteed, but there's a reasonable expectation that the numbers might come down anyway, even without any changes in policy. But by all means, the government could decide to be more restrictive in any number of areas if it wanted to, in the area of health and care, for example. It could say that it wanted more restrictions there and wanted to increase training or paying conditions domestically instead. The question whether it's desirable is one where reasonable people will disagree, and I think it will depend on the specific routes you're looking at. And I think the sort of overall challenge that governments face is that even where there's a desire to bring down overall migration numbers when people are looking at the headline figures, sometimes the constituent parts that actually make up that migration can be reasonably popular. And so it's not necessarily easy to find areas to cut without any consequences or without people disagreeing.
I mean, it is still fair, though, to say that the British economy, to an extent, relies on migration, relies on workers coming from overseas to this country. It's just difficult to put that side by side with some of the rhetoric that emerges from the right wing of the ruling party, the Conservatives.
I think that, it's certainly true that many employers have a business model that is very reliant on migrant workers. If you take something like seasonal work, I think that's an industry that basically couldn't survive in its current form without seasonal workers coming from overseas. I think nothing's inevitable, though. I think I'm slightly skeptical of suggestions that we simply need a certain number of people, because it always comes down to choices, often outside of immigration. So in the case of the soft fruit industry, very labour-intensive industry, I think the big question there is there's no optimal number of raspberries that the UK needs to be producing, right? It sort of comes down to actually questions that are not really about immigration policy of, how big a food production industry do we want in this country? And there, I think reasonable people will disagree.
Madeleine, your job as director of the Migration Observatory gives you the perfect position from which to answer this question. Do you think that we have a genuinely informed conversation and debate about migration in this country?
Depends what you mean by genuinely informed. I think there's always there's a lot of data, and I think legitimately it's quite it's very complicated, and I think it's quite difficult sometimes for people to understand the complexity of migration. So if you take something like today, you may have reasonably high quality statistics and people can talk about what those data mean. But underneath the headline figures, whether it's 606,000 or anything else, there are many, many different policies, each of which is sort of technically quite complex, that contribute to all of that. And so I think it is inevitable that, some of that really important detail gets lost in the overall discussion.
Do you think we will ever get down to the tens of thousands as David Cameron promised all those years ago?
No, I don't, basically. So, it looks like we did briefly just dip below 100,000 in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. I think that's the kind of thing that gets you below 100,000. I don't see the numbers getting down to that kind of level without some, really significant change to the entire model. You wouldn't get to that sort of level with just trimming around the edges.
Well, I will keep my fingers crossed that Suella Braverman does not propose a global pandemic to try and bring down the immigration numbers in future. My thanks to Madeleine Sumption, Ali Fortescue, Tom Cheshire, and of course to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.